for this short period of time. I'm sorry I missed the rest of the meeting. I was just in Los Angeles, and they were having the 7th International Congress of Neuropsychoanalysis. So all of a sudden, psychoanalysis is listening to brain research, and hopefully it seems like everyone's listening to brain research. Unfortunately, brain research is not listening to you. It's not listening to the human experience, and that's why there's room for discipline like neuropsychoanalysis. So we have a century of a tradition that truly wanted to understand the human experience. Neuroscience is not really even trying to catch up. I think the main problem that an addict faces is pretty much the same problem that we face, which is the power of our emotionality, the power of our feelings. We make our choices by things that feel good and things that feel bad. So this is affective neuroeconomics. And neuroscience should be telling us what is the deep nature of affect, what are these drugs actually doing in the human brain. It's not just reward, it's not just reinforcement, these old behavioristic words. There are many, many affective experiences. So I think that's why I was invited. I've been one of the people that has taken human emotional experience seriously as a scientific topic. And back when I was a young clinical psychology student, I realized that I would not understand these things by studying human beings, that we are creatures of evolution and we share these powerful tools with the other animals. So I decided to go into animal research because of this. So I am going to skip across a lot of slides. What took me into emotion research was the discovery or the reports in 1973 of the first receptor system in the brain, which was the opiate receptor system. And finally, people had a target for the 3 main uses of opiates in medicine, which is, of course, pain control, control of coughing, and control of diarrhea. But you can see these dark areas here in the rat brain. This was the first photographic atlas of opiate receptors. They're all over the place. They're doing piles and piles of things. And the one idea we had was that they were the main messengers of positive social feelings. And I think now that's a demonstrated fact in neuroscience. And it fits with Stanton Peele's idea about the same time that love is an addictive process. We become dependent on each other and things like that. Postulate there would be no addictions without affective change. But my field is still stumbling across this dilemma that there's an impenetrable mystery in the fact that subjective experience exists in a physiochemical world. But it does, so it's an emergent property. Get on with the business of understanding it. But we're stuck still arguing, does it exist, especially in animals? You know, the people doing fear research right now, you might know names like Ledoux, etc., etc. They say their animals experience no fear. They just have fear reflexes. That's bullshit, as I think it was said in French a little while ago. So we might ask, would drug addiction exist if drugs did not change our internal feelings? And in this Festschrift for Paul MacLean that I wrote a foreword for, I gave the answer. Clearly the answer is no, and not only from members of our own species. Other animals also get addicted to exactly the same drugs for exactly the same affective reasons. So that's why the animal research is so important for everyone working with addiction to appreciate and understand. So I take an evolutionary approach to the poppy seed and what it does in our minds. Psychology has unfortunately become the impoverished stepchild in the neuroscience crusade to understand addiction. So the neuroscience crusade comes from behaviorism, stimulus, response. Once the money for behavioristic research dried up in the 1970s, it became stimulus, brain, response. There was no room for mind, which is unfortunate because that's one of the main things the brain does, is create mind and mental processes. So we right now have a neuroscience that is fundamentally sterile in terms of its true conception or its conception of the true nature of reality. Mentality exists. How far it goes in neural evolution, we don't know, but all mammals have minds, and the part of the mind they share is affective experience. So rats enjoy sweetness because they've got a pleasure response. Cats don't care for it, right? Cats don't care for sweetness. They like protein. So there's a lot of variability in detail, but the principles are the same. We have neglected the neuroscience of affective feelings. And I had this long quotation for Alfred North Whitehead. How much time do I have? Yeah, I'm going to skip across all these wonderful quotations. He was a wonderful man that recognized the complexity of reality. So what I wanted to cover was psychological perspectives on addictive rewards, the nature of reinforcement, this psychological law of effect, which should have been the law of affect, namely this spooky thing called reinforcement is how affect controls learning. Hello. But it was thrown out because affect is spooky, affect is subjective. Social affect as a source of addictive urges. Social reward is probably the most addictive of the affects because all our evolutionary progression rides upon having social bonds and social relationships. And therefore evolution is assured that especially in animals like us, where both mother and father need to take care of the child, and the child is completely helpless, that mother and father do get addicted to each other, at least for a while, maybe not forever, and the little ones get powerfully addicted to mom especially, dad also, until they become independent enough to chase other affects, namely they mature sexually. So there's also a general purpose desire system, maybe similar to Freud's libido, a life energy that doesn't know what to do with itself because it's born really stupid. It has to learn what to do, but it's this desire to chase things in the world that enhance survival. And there's piles of things to learn about. So it's a general purpose seeking learning system, and dopamine is at the heart of it. And that's why cocaine addiction becomes so much more dramatically habitual compared to opiate addiction. People can regulate their opiate addiction as long as you have weak opiates. But of course, they manufacture such super powerful opiates that addiction became a personal disaster. The old-time opiates were more manageable. And we have a new measure of appetitive desire in animals. A basic response from rats that say, I like it, I want more. Hello, life is good. And it's a 50 kilohertz vocalization that we have become notorious for demonstrating that it is an ancestral form of laughter. And when little children are anticipating things, bring them a present, but they can't have it, you say, hold it out of reach, they jump, and they're happy. That kind of joy of getting something seemed to produce a laughter response. And then unanticipated things like jokes also started to generate laughter. I don't think rats have jokes, but maybe some slapstick, but simple childlike humor. Perhaps no one studied it, but boy, do they chirp when you tickle them. and when they play. I'll try to show you a video of that because it's so compelling and so powerful, and it's been my gauntlet to my colleagues to say, I think it's laughter. You proved me wrong, because we've done serious science for 8 years with such a mountain of evidence that you have to give us a better interpretation of this. And this measure turns out to be a superb measure of drug desire. So now for the first time, we can ask an animal, do you really want it? And when they chirp, chit, 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 you know they want it. And we have mapped out the system of this in the brain, and it turns out to be the classic Olds and Milner reward reinforcement system. It runs right along it. But I'm not going to show you all that evidence in the next 25 minutes. Some obvious theses concerning brain, mind, and emotion. The fundamental affective systems of the mind reflect various evolutionary adaptive functions of the brain. They are ancestral tools for living. They are the voices of our genes. But in our modern search to understand the mechanisms of brain and mind, we neuroscientists often choose to forget that widespread neural networks generate various psychological processes that regulate behavior. This is not territory that is accepted in my field. But the bottom line is thinking, perceiving, feeling, and behaving, and getting addicted are not simply properties of brain molecules. That's where NIDA is tossing all its money, just brain molecules. That's all you need to know, in the animal models at least. To understand how brains generate addictions, we also need psychological perspectives based on a network doctrine. Complex neuronal networks designed to do important things like affects and emotions. Right now we're stuck with a neuron doctrine, and so many of my colleagues trot out this study by Lamb in Journal of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics, and they claim this is evidence that addiction is unconscious. This study is commonly used to argue that addiction can be sustained by unconscious reward, unexperienced reward, or reinforcement processes. If you go and read that study with a sensitive psychological eye, a careful reading indicates this study indicates nothing of the sort. Take me the rest of the time to explain this study, but it's simple misinterpretation of a very straightforward study, but people choose to misuse it. So my conjecture, and I think yours too, is that human pipe dreams or subjective reality were not more enticing than external reality. Namely, affects are built into our system. That's the internal reality. There would be no addictions. They can't exist without affective feelings. That's my bottom line. So how do we understand these spooky things called affects? Primitive mentality, as George mentioned, the psychological properties of the reptilian brain. You have to take a cross-species evolutionary perspective. Here's my image of the triune brain, Paul MacLean's neocortex, limbic system, reptilian brain. You see the little bird there and the rat, all in a human mind. Well, you have a triune, you have a layered mind too. And to understand addiction, you have to understand the lowest layers of mentality. That's why addiction is so hard, because the lowest layers become very habitual. The feeling of affect initially guides behavior, but then if the behavior doesn't require new adjustments, it becomes habitual. That's very streamlined, very effective, and ultimately addiction is so horrible because it takes over the habitual structures of the brain. Affects provide the comfort zones by which all humans and all animals live their lives. Of course, if everything is taken care of, then we can develop intellectual pursuits But until that moment, it's comfort zones. So this mystery is no longer impenetrable, and it's only penetrable by neuroscience. Experience, thousands of years of human experience, give us poetry and art, but they still leave it as a fundamental mystery. So we've been studying emotional feelings. There are many other kinds of feelings. And our approach has been simply this. There's an instinctual apparatus in all our brains. And when this cat is behaving this way, this cat is angry. This is what we call dual aspect monism. Complex networks have several different properties. It's like light having wave and particle functions. Angry behavior reflects angry feelings. And the emotions act out into the world in dramatic but dynamic ways. So the animal can readjust its behavior depending upon what's happening in the environment. So they're all learning systems. And there's a bunch of these systems in the brain, which I summarize in affective neuroscience. Not necessarily a complete list, but one that can be defended by lots of data. So contact comfort. The feeling of goodness from a hug, from a touch, from a massage, from sex is controlled by brain opioids. This is still the main pleasure molecule of the brain. So this system receives lots of pleasures, including the comfort of being held. So we did this study in little birds. Little bird is left alone, it cries, beep, 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 beep. You pick it up, it stops crying. Every time, every time, every time. Just as if it were under the mother's wings. It relaxes, its head goes down, eyes close, falls asleep. This is an opioid nod. Because if you give the anti-opioids like naltrexone or naloxone to the bird does not settle down as well. It takes the animal 4 times as long to become relaxed. It still becomes relaxed, at least outwardly, but it takes much longer. So part of contact comfort is opioid mediated. That's the natural reward. That's why a person in withdrawal deserves a big hug every once in a while. Yeah. Yeah, there's many possible interpretations. We assume that this behavioral response has to be a comfort response. I would get stuck there in a philosophical argument with you, discussion right now. So let me move on. Okay. Not surprisingly, from an evolutionary point of view, was prolactin. So the molecule that manufactures the milk of human kindness, oxytocin, that which releases the milk to the child, and opioids, the general pleasure system of the brain, those were the 3 that dramatically alleviated separation distress. So we think that both oxytocin and prolactin, which are not addictive by themselves, are targets for drug development for addiction, because they can alleviate that social pain that people want to control. That feeling of alienation, isolation, the main reason for taking these kinds of drugs. Remember also, depression is a pleasure deficit. And opioids are superb antidepressants. They were used before the 1950s brought us the Mayo inhibitors and the tricyclic antidepressants, wasn't it? So we have been studying these systems in the brain for a very long time, and I just want to show you briefly what play looks like. This is our main system right now. Here's what animals do when they are spontaneously given the opportunity. They just boogie, and there's a brain system designed for this kind of, they just go wild. And this becomes as powerful a reward as any reward that the animals have in the world. And a famous emotion researcher, Rob Plutchik, was in the lab one day. I said, Rob, I want to show you behavior. And I didn't tell him what I was going to show him. I put two animals in a cage, they did this. And he said, oh, yuck, how did you train the animals to fight that way? And I said, Rob, I didn't train them, evolution did. And by the way, they're not fighting, they're playing. This is a real emotional system in the brain. So, I think this system generates social joy. So the more we understand this system, the more we use it, I guess in George's words, the emotions are spiritual systems, if used well, the positive emotions. And this is the most positive emotion. If one can capture that joyful impulse again, whatever is required, then you're on the road, I think, to recovery. So we have, we've done such a mountain of work on this. You're going to be spared all of it. But I'm not going to spare you the demonstration of rat laughter. And the fact that we are working out the genetics of this system right now. Here's what we found. This 50 kilohertz sound that occurs so readily in play that you just saw. And then we tickled animals and it went just out of sight. And we said after many years of study, perhaps it's laughter. And we had a paper summarizing 12 reasons you should take this idea seriously. The more a person will laugh with others in a positive way, the more they're on their way to recovery, I think, and to be whole in a human way. So here's the first documentation of this 8 years ago in this documentary. As we have listened to animals playing, we have heard what appeared to be the sounds of laughter. And we studied these for a couple of years without quite understanding that this might be laughter. And then one day we decided to tickle some animals. And we realized that we had to look at the sounds at a very different register than we can hear. So we obtained these transducers that are called bat detectors that can bring very high frequencies down to our auditory range. And when we did this and we listened in, we could tickle animals and generate a lot of vocal activity that appeared to be laughter. These animals would begin to enjoy our company, and they would start to play with our hands, and wherever we would put our hands, they would follow it. And when we tested these animals to ask whether they were enjoying this kind of activity, the unambiguous answer was yes. This stuff is highly addictive. Natural joy. Once an animal has chirped like that with you, it will follow you and seek you out and, basically be a friend. That's why we love pets, because certain animals have very responsive systems like this for our social interaction. So let me just stop there and put one of my favorite quotes on the board. And you have probably seen this quote by William James. Let me just read it. We are spinning our own fates, good or evil, never to be undone. Well, hopefully not. The drunken Rip Van Winkle excuses himself for every fresh dereliction by saying, I won't count this time. Well, he may not count it, and a kind heaven may not count it, but it is being counted nonetheless. Down among his nerve cells and fibers, the molecules are counting it, registering and storing it up to be used against them when the next temptation arises. Like George said, ultimately, the best approach is to rejoin the human family. And I think AA and those approaches allow that to happen. So thank you for this short journey.